What if everything you thought you knew about black towns in America was a lie? Communities built with pride, strength, and success were wiped off the map, not by chance, but by design. Why were thriving black towns destroyed? Who benefited from erasing these histories? Today, uncover the untold stories of 7 black towns that vanished. Stories no one wants you to know. Stay close. The truth is about to shatter everything. Number 7. Overtown, Miami, Florida. Overtown was once known as the Little Broadway of the South, a vibrant cultural hub renowned for its thriving black-owned businesses, jazz clubs, theaters, and churches that formed the backbone of a tight-knit community. During the early to mid-20th century, Overtown was a place where black culture and economic independence flourished, despite the harsh realities of segregation. But in the 1960s, everything changed. The federal and city governments initiated massive urban renewal projects, ostensibly to improve infrastructure that cut right through the heart of Overtown. The construction of highways and new developments displaced more than 12,000 black residents, tearing apart families and businesses. Without warning, entire blocks of this thriving community were demolished in the name of progress. This act of urban renewal was, in effect, a systemic erasure. The cultural heart of Miami's black community was shattered, replaced by highways and developments that benefited others, but displaced the very people who built Overtown. Such destruction wasn't accidental, but part of a pattern of targeted displacement across the U.S. that erased black prosperity and self-sufficiency. How do you rebuild a community when it's bulldozed before your eyes? What happens to the stories and legacies of thousands uprooted in the name of progress? And who really gains when black neighborhoods are sacrificed to the powers that be? Number 6. Seneca Village, New York. In the mid-1800s, Seneca Village was one of the few places in Manhattan where free black families could own land and build a life far from the harsh restrictions of a racially segregated society. Founded in 1825, this small, tight-knit community grew to nearly 300 residents, complete with churches, schools, and homes, a rare sanctuary of black autonomy and dignity. However, in 1857, the city of New York used eminent domain to seize the land from Seneca Village residents with little to no compensation, so they could build what we now know as Central Park. This green jewel was paved over the homes and lives of black New Yorkers, erasing an important chapter of black history from public memory. This forced removal was more than just a real estate transaction. It was a deliberate effort to displace black communities under the guise of urban improvement. Despite protests, the residents were pushed out, and Seneca Village vanished beneath the park's rolling lawns and pathways. How could a city justify demolishing a thriving community to create a park that doesn't tell their story? What were the human costs behind the beauty of Central Park? And why does this history remain hidden while millions walk over the land every day without knowing its past? Number 5. MOVE, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. MOVE was a black liberation group committed to communal living and activism in Philadelphia. For years, they faced intense surveillance, harassment, and confrontation with city authorities. The tension peaked in 1985 when the Philadelphia Police Department dropped a bomb on MOVE's residential row house in the Osage Avenue neighborhood, a moment unprecedented in U.S. history. The bomb ignited a fire that destroyed 61 homes and killed 11 people, including 5 children. Entire families were lost in an event that shocked the nation, but was quickly buried in official reports and public discourse. MOVE's destruction was not just an act of law enforcement, but a brutal statement that dissent from black communities would be met with extreme violence. Why did the government choose to bomb citizens on their own soil? How did this event slip from national memory while similar tragedies are remembered? What does MOVE say about the limits of freedom and justice in America? Number 4. Rosewood, Florida. Rosewood was a quiet, thriving black community in Florida during the early 20th century, founded by African-American families who sought refuge from the racism and violence elsewhere. Rosewood represented hope, resilience, and self-sufficiency. The town had its own schools, churches, and businesses, a stronghold of black independence in the segregated South. But beneath this peace lurked danger. In January 1923, a shocking claim shattered the fragile stability. A white woman in a nearby town accused a black man of assault. Whether the accusation was true or false is still debated, but the accusation itself unleashed a violent white mob resembling a lynch mob bent on destruction. Armed men from the surrounding white communities descended on Rosewood. Over the next week, they killed at least 150 black residents, including women and children, and burned every home, business, and church to the ground. Survivors were terrorized into fleeing for their lives, abandoning the community that took generations to build. The local government and media largely ignored or downplayed the massacre. For decades, Rosewood's history was suppressed and forgotten outside of survivor stories and oral tradition. It wasn't until the 1990s that the state of Florida officially acknowledged the massacre and offered reparations to the surviving families, a rare but important act of justice. Rosewood's destruction was more than an isolated act of racial violence. It was part of a pattern of brutal suppression that targeted prosperous black communities across America. How does a town vanish so completely? Erased not only from maps, but collective memory. What does this say about the American narrative that so often excludes black resilience and success? The legacy of Rosewood remains a powerful reminder of the dangers black communities faced and continue to face in their quest for safety, autonomy, and dignity. It asks us to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic racism and the price of black prosperity in U.S. history. Number 3. Wilmington, North Carolina. Wilmington, North Carolina, was once a thriving port city with a significant black population that held substantial economic and political power in the late 19th century. After the Civil War, black citizens in Wilmington achieved a remarkable level of political representation, owning businesses and serving in government. This period was a beacon of hope for racial progress in the post-Reconstruction South. But this hope was violently shattered in 1898 during what is now known as the Wilmington Coup, or Wilmington Massacre, the only successful coup d'etat in U.S. history. White supremacists, angry at losing political control, orchestrated a brutal overthrow of the city government, overthrowing a legally elected biracial government. On November 10, 1898, a mob of white citizens armed themselves and attacked black neighborhoods, killing an estimated 60 to 300 African Americans, though official numbers remain disputed due to attempts to cover up the violence. Homes, churches, and black-owned businesses were destroyed in a coordinated campaign of terror. Black leaders were forced to flee, replaced by white supremacists, who quickly enacted policies to disenfranchise black voters and segregate the city. This violent coup marked the beginning of an era of Jim Crow laws that would oppress black Americans for decades to come. The Wilmington Massacre reveals how fragile political power was for black Americans, even when legally attained. It raises haunting questions. How could democracy be overturned by violence so openly? What does this history tell us about the lengths white supremacists would go to maintain control? And how does this dark chapter continue to influence racial dynamics today? The destruction of Wilmington's black political power was more than a local tragedy. It was a harsh message to black communities across the South and the nation. This violent erasure shaped the struggle for civil rights that continues to this day, proving that the fight for black freedom and equality has always been met with fierce resistance. Number 2. Harlem, New York. Harlem is often celebrated as the beating heart of African American culture and the birthplace of the Harlem Renaissance, a revolutionary period during the 1920s and 1930s where black writers, musicians, and artists transformed not just their community, but the world's understanding of black identity. Figures like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, and Marcus Garvey brought forward expressions of pride, creativity, and political activism that reshaped America's cultural landscape. But behind the brilliance was a complex reality. Harlem was never fully owned or controlled by the black residents who built it. Despite the cultural power, economic control remained firmly out of their hands due to systemic racism embedded in real estate and political structures. Landlords often exploited black tenants by charging high rents for poorly maintained buildings. Wealth generated within the community rarely translated into economic empowerment. Urban renewal projects, discriminatory housing laws, and gentrification constantly threatened the stability of Harlem. Many residents lived under the fear of displacement, even as the neighborhood thrived artistically. This paradox of cultural flourishing amid economic struggle exposes the enduring challenges in the fight for black autonomy. Why was Harlem allowed to flourish culturally, but denied in economic power? What does Harlem's story tell us about the larger struggle against systemic barriers that continue to shape black communities today? It forces us to question how success and progress are measured and for whom. Harlem's legacy is both inspiring and cautionary, a reminder that artistic and intellectual brilliance must be supported by economic justice to create lasting change. The fight for Harlem is the fight for black economic freedom and self-determination still playing out in cities across America. Number 1. Greenwood/Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Greenwood was a flourishing black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, famously known as Black Wall Street, a remarkable symbol of black economic independence and prosperity in the early 20th century. Established by African Americans who built their own businesses, banks, hotels, theaters, and newspapers, Greenwood became one of the most successful black communities in the United States. At its peak, Greenwood was a place where black families thrived, despite the institutional racism and segregation pervasive in the Jim Crow South. The community had everything needed to prosper independently: schools, churches, doctors, lawyers, and vibrant cultural institutions. Black-owned businesses flourished, and many residents considered Greenwood a safe haven and a beacon of hope. But on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, this thriving community was destroyed in one of the most brutal episodes of racial violence in U.S. history, the Tulsa Race Massacre. It began with tensions sparked by a false accusation against a young black man. White mobs, many armed and supported by local police, and even the National Guard, descended on Greenwood with devastating force. For 18 hours, Greenwood was set ablaze. Over 35 blocks were destroyed, 1,200 homes burned, and up to 300 black residents were killed or wounded. The massacre left thousands homeless and stripped the community of its wealth, power, and dignity. Survivors faced intimidation, failed promises of help, and decades of silence and denial from authorities and historians alike. This attack was not random violence. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy black success and prevent economic empowerment. The massacre was erased from official history for decades, with survivors and their descendants living with the trauma and the loss. Greenwood's story forces us to ask, what happens when a community dares to rise against a system built on oppression? How does history change when tragedies like this are buried and erased? And most importantly, what does Greenwood teach us about resilience, justice, and the fight to reclaim a legacy stolen by violence? The destruction of these black towns is not just history. It's a reflection of systemic forces designed to silence black success and erase legacies of resilience. What happens when the stories of entire communities are wiped away? How does that loss shape the world we live in today? If you think you've heard the full story, think again. The truth is far more complicated, and the fight for recognition, justice, and reclaimed pride continues. Stay close, because the next chapter will reveal secrets that those who erased history feared most.